In the autumn of 1893, a surveyor named Elias Ketchum was hired by the territorial government of Oklahoma to complete a task that should have been routine. The land runs of 1889 and 1891 had opened millions of acres of former Indian territory to white settlement, and the federal government needed accurate maps of the newly designated counties. Ketchum was one of dozens of surveyors working the territory, a man in his late 40s with a solid reputation and a quiet manner. He had surveyed land in Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado. He had never failed to complete a contract. On October 12, 1893, Ketchum rode into a section of the Cherokee Outlet that had been opened to settlement 2 years earlier. The land was rolling prairie, broken by occasional groves of oak and cottonwood, cut by creeks that ran clear and cold. There were homesteads now where there had been only grass and sage, families who had staked claims in the chaos of the land run and were trying to build something from the dust. Ketchum's job was to verify the boundaries of the claims, to mark the corners, to ensure that the land records matched the ground. He was working his section near the Salt Fork of the Arkansas River when his horse balked. The animal stopped dead, its ears flat against its skull, refusing to move forward. Ketchum dismounted and walked ahead, leading the horse by the bridle. The ground looked no different from the surrounding prairie, sandy soil, sparse grass, a few scattered stones. But the horse would not cross it. Ketchum knelt and brushed away the surface soil. Beneath it, no more than 6 inches deep, he found a seam of what he initially took to be pale limestone. But the shape was wrong. It was too regular, too symmetrical. He dug further with his hands, his surveyor's knife, and then with a small spade from his saddlebag. What he uncovered was not rock. It was bone. The partial skeleton of a man, lying on his side, his arms folded as if in sleep. The bones were weathered but intact, suggesting a burial of perhaps 20 or 30 years. Around the remains, Ketchum found fragments of cloth, a brass button, and a leather pouch that crumbled to dust when he touched it. The man had been buried with his belongings. He had been buried deliberately. And the burial was so shallow that the prairie grass had never fully reclaimed the ground. Ketchum was a practical man. He had seen death before. He knew that the territory had been the scene of violence, that the land runs had displaced people who had lived on the land for generations, that there were graves scattered across the prairie that had never been marked or recorded. But something about this burial troubled him. The man had not been thrown into a shallow grave by killers. He had been laid to rest with care, his arms folded, his possessions beside him. Ketchum covered the grave and continued his survey. He did not report the discovery to the sheriff or to the land office. He was not sure why. Perhaps it was the horse's refusal to cross the ground. Perhaps it was the careful arrangement of the bones. Perhaps it was the fact that the grave was not marked, that no one in the settlement seemed to know about it, that the land records showed no burial ground in that section. What Ketchum found over the next 3 days would force him to confront the possibility that the entire township had been built on a lie. He found the second grave on the following day, about a quarter mile from the first. The same pattern, a shallow burial, a body laid to rest with care, no marker, no record. The third grave was on the ridge above the creek. The fourth was at the base of a sandstone outcropping. By the time Ketchum completed his survey of that single section, he had documented 12 graves. 12 bodies, buried in the same shallow, unmarked manner, arranged in a pattern that had no relationship to any known cemetery or burial ground in the territory. He rode into the settlement that evening and went to the general store, where he asked the proprietor if he knew anything about graves in the section he had been surveying. The proprietor was a man named Otis Vance, a homesteader from Iowa who had been in the territory for 3 years. Vance's face went still when Ketchum asked the question. He said, "There's graves all over this country, Mr. Ketchum. You get used to them." But he would not say more. And when Ketchum pressed him, Vance retreated behind the counter and busied himself with his accounts. The conversation was over. Ketchum spent the next week asking questions in the scattered homesteads of the settlement. He found no one who could tell him who the dead were or how they had come to be buried in that particular patch of prairie. But he found something else. He found a story that had been passed down through the families of the settlement, a story that had never been written down, that was spoken only in whispers, late at night, when the children were asleep. The story was about a man named Asa Cray, who had owned a trading post in the region before the land runs. Asa Cray had been a man of peculiar habits and darker appetites. He had kept a ledger in which he recorded his transactions, not the usual accounts of the trading post, but something else. A record of people. People who had come to his post and had been listed in his ledger, like items in an inventory. People who had never left. The story claimed that Asa Cray had died in 1886, 7 years before Ketchum's survey, and that the ledger he kept had been burned or buried or hidden, depending on who told the version. The story also claimed that the graves Ketchum had found were the graves of Asa Cray's customers, the people whose names appeared in his ledger, the people who had been bought and sold like livestock. Ketchum found no confirmation of the story in any official record. The Asa Cray name did not appear in the county deed books. There was no record of a trading post in that section of the Cherokee Outlet. The story was just that, a story, passed down through the families of the settlement, believed by some, dismissed by others, never written down. But Ketchum could not shake the feeling that the story was true. And he could not shake the memory of the horse refusing to cross that patch of ground. To understand what Ketchum found in the Cherokee Outlet, you have to understand the world of Indian Territory in the decades after the Civil War. The region that would become Oklahoma was a place of extraordinary complexity, a landscape of overlapping jurisdictions, competing claims, and systematic dispossession. The 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, had been forced from their ancestral lands in the southeast in the 1830s. The treaties that had guaranteed their perpetual ownership of the territory were being systematically violated by the federal government, by railroad interests, and by the relentless pressure of white settlement. The Cherokee Outlet was a strip of land in the northern part of the Cherokee Nation, reserved by treaty for hunting grounds. It had been leased to cattle companies and had become a major corridor for cattle drives from Texas to the Kansas railheads. The Cherokee used the land for grazing and hunting. For decades, it had been one of the few remaining areas of the territory that had not been open to white settlement. The land runs of 1889 and 1891 changed all of that. The federal government opened millions of acres of the territory to white settlement, and the Cherokee Outlet was among the lands that were taken. The Cherokee were given compensation, but it was a fraction of the value of the land. The people who had lived on the land for generations were displaced, their claims erased, their histories buried. The settlement where Ketchum did his survey was called Eden, a name that was meant to suggest a new beginning. The homesteaders who had come in the land run of 1891 had built cabins and planted crops and tried to make a life on the prairie. They were not, for the most part, the kind of people who asked questions about the history of the land. They had come to build a future, and they were not interested in the past. But the past, as Ketchum was discovering, had a way of refusing to stay buried. The graves he had found were not the only evidence of the violence that had been done to this land. The story of Asa Cray and his ledger was one of many such stories, fragments of a history that had been deliberately erased. The United States had been expanding across the continent since the Louisiana Purchase, and the expansion had been accompanied by a systematic pattern of land theft, violence, and forced removal. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 had set the pattern, and the federal government had followed it for decades. The land runs were the final stage of that process, the moment when the last pieces of the territory were open to white settlement. The people who had been displaced had their claims erased, their graves unmarked, their histories unwritten. The Cherokee Outlet had its own stories. It was the home of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Wichita, and Kiowa people, who had been forced from their own lands in the plains and had been relocated to the territory. They had lived on the land in an uneasy coexistence with the Cherokee, and they had been displaced again when the land runs came. The graves that Ketchum found might have been Cherokee, or they might have been some other people whose names had been erased from the record. What was not erased was the pattern. The land had been taken, the people had been removed, and the history had been buried. The graves were the physical evidence of a truth that the settlement had been trying to forget. The people in this story are not the famous heroes and villains of American history. They are the ordinary people who lived and died in a place that was being transformed by forces they could not control. Elias Ketchum was a surveyor, a man who had spent his life measuring the land, marking its boundaries, creating the maps that would determine who owned what. He was a decent man, by all accounts, a man who believed in the rule of law and the importance of accurate records. He had no reason to doubt the official version of history. But the graves he found forced him to confront a truth he had not been prepared to see. Otis Vance was a homesteader, a man who had come to the territory in search of a better life. He had staked a claim, built a cabin, and was trying to make a living on the prairie. He knew about the graves, and he knew about the story of Asa Cray. He had chosen to forget both, to focus on the future rather than the past. Asa Cray is a shadowy figure. The stories about him are fragmentary, contradictory, and impossible to verify. Some say he was a traitor, a man who dealt fairly with the Indians and the settlers alike. Others say he was a man of darker appetites, a man who used his position to exploit the vulnerable. His ledger, if it existed, has never been found. The dead were not given a name in the story. They were the customers of the trading post, the people who had passed through and left no record of their existence. They were the ancestors of the people who had been displaced, the people whose land had been taken, the people who had been erased from history. The murders that led to the creation of the ledger are not known in their specific details. But the pattern is clear. In the decades before the land runs, the Cherokee Outlet was a place of lawlessness. There were few courts, few marshals, and few institutions that could protect the vulnerable. People who came to the region were often at the mercy of the men who had power. Asa Cray's trading post was one of those places where power was concentrated. The people who came to Cray's post were not the rich or the powerful. They were travelers, homesteaders, displaced Indians, people who had nowhere else to go. They traded what they had: furs, livestock, labor, and they were often cheated. But the ledger, if it existed, recorded something more than cheating. It recorded people who had come to the post and had never left, people who had been bought and sold like livestock, people who had been buried in shallow graves on the prairie. The stories about Asa Cray began to circulate after his death in 1886. The people who told the stories were the people who had survived him, the people who had escaped his trading post and had made their way to the settlements. They told the stories to their children and their grandchildren, and the stories were passed down through the generations. In 1890, the story of Asa Cray was told to a newspaper reporter from Kansas, who wrote an article about the legend of the trading post. The article was published in a Wichita newspaper and was picked up by other papers in the region. It included a description of Asa Cray's ledger, a leather-bound book that listed the names of his customers and the price they had been paid for. The article claimed that the ledger had been buried with Cray, hidden in a place that only he knew. The article caused a sensation at the time, but it was quickly forgotten. The land runs were underway, and the settlers were focused on building their new lives. The story of Asa Cray was just a story, a piece of local legend. But for some people, the story was not fiction. It was the truth, a truth that had been deliberately hidden. Ketchum did not know about the newspaper article. He had not been in the territory in 1890. But the stories he heard from the settlers were consistent with the article. The same names, the same details, the same pattern of violence and concealment. And when he found the graves, he knew that the stories were true. Ketchum's investigation of the graves was not a formal investigation. He did not report his findings to the sheriff or the land office. But he kept a record of what he had found, a journal that described the graves, the location, and the stories he had heard. That journal, eventually, would find its way to a historian who would understand its significance. The investigation that followed was not conducted by a sheriff or a marshal. It was conducted by a woman named Dr. Margaret Choate, a historian who came to the territory in the 1920s to study the history of the Cherokee Outlet. Choate was a rare figure in her time, a woman with a doctorate in history from the University of Chicago who was determined to document the history of the region. Choate had been told about the story of Asa Cray by one of the older settlers in the area. He had given her a copy of the newspaper article from 1890 and had told her about the graves that had been found by the surveyor in 1893. Choate began to investigate, using the resources available to her in the 1920s. She searched the county records, the land offices, and the archives in Washington, D.C. She found no mention of Asa Cray in any official record. She found no record of the graves that Ketchum had documented. she found no evidence that the crime had ever been investigated. But Choate was not deterred. She interviewed the descendants of the homesteaders, the people who had heard the stories from their parents and grandparents. She found the families who had told the story of Asa Cray to Ketchum in 1893. And she found a single piece of evidence that confirmed the story. One of the men she interviewed was a homesteader named Benjamin Hollister, who had come to the territory in the land run of 1891. Hollister was in his 60s by the time Choate met him, and he was a man of few words. But he had one piece of evidence that he had kept hidden for decades. Hollister had been the owner of the general store where Ketchum had first asked about the graves. He had kept a copy of the ledger that Asa Cray had used. It was not the original. It was a transcript that had been made by a man named Hiram Wheeling, who had been a clerk at the trading post before Cray's death. Wheeling had left the post in 1885, a year before Cray died, and had taken a copy of the ledger with him. Hollister had obtained the transcript from Wheeling in 1892, a year after the land run. He had kept it hidden, fearing that its discovery would cause trouble for the settlement. But when Choate asked him about the story of Asa Cray, Hollister decided to reveal what he had. The transcript was a detailed record of the trading post's transactions, including the names of people who had passed through the post and the transactions they had made. But the transcript was not a conventional ledger. It was a record of people, not goods. It listed the names of travelers, the date of their arrival, and the price they had been paid for. Some of the names were marked with a symbol, a small cross, that indicated that the person had never left. Choate examined the transcript carefully. She found the names of 12 people who had been marked with the cross. She found the names of families who had been separated, children who had been sold, women who had been taken as servants. She found evidence of a systematic pattern of exploitation, a trading post that had been a cover for human trafficking. The transcript was not a single piece of evidence. It was a collection of evidence, a record of the crimes that had been committed at the trading post. And it was enough to confirm the story that had been told for decades, the story of Asa Cray and his ledger. Choate documented her findings in a book that was published in 1935. The book was titled The Lost History of the Cherokee Outlet, and it was a comprehensive account of the region's history, including the story of Asa Cray. The book was well reviewed in academic circles, but it did not reach a wide audience. The Great Depression was underway, and the public was not interested in a history of a forgotten corner of Oklahoma. The transcript of the ledger was placed in the archives of the Oklahoma Historical Society, where it remains to this day. It is a fragment of a larger history, a record of a crime that was never punished and a truth that was almost buried forever. The story of Asa Cray did not end with Choate's investigation. It continued, in the families who had been affected by his crimes and in the land that had been stolen from its original inhabitants. The people who had been bought and sold at the trading post were not forgotten by their descendants. They passed the stories down, and they kept the memory alive. In the 1960s, a descendant of one of the victims of the trading post contacted the Oklahoma Historical Society and asked about the ledger. The transcript was shown to her, and she recognized the name of her ancestor. The discovery of the ledger was a turning point for the family. They had not known the full extent of the crimes that had been committed against their ancestors. The ledger was a confirmation of what they had suspected, a piece of evidence that connected them to a history of suffering and exploitation. In 1970, a group of descendants of the victims of the trading post organized a ceremony at the site of the graves. They placed a marker at the location, a stone that bore the names of the 12 people who had been buried there. The marker was a small act of remembrance, but it was an acknowledgement of a truth that had been hidden for decades. The land where the trading post had stood is now part of a state park. Visitors can walk through the prairie and see the marker, a reminder of a history that has been largely forgotten. The marker bears the words that Ketchum had written in his journal in 1893. They were laid to rest without ceremony. May they find peace. The mystery of the ledger was not solved in the conventional sense. The identity of the victim and the murderer, the circumstances of the crime, and the fate of the ledger are all lost to history. But the discovery of the ledger was enough to confirm the truth of the story that had been told for decades. The story of the ledger is a reminder that history is not always recorded in the official records. It is passed down in families, in stories, in the memory of the land. It is a reminder that the past is never really past and that the dead do not rest when the living refuse to remember them. Ketchum's horse, the animal that balked at crossing the grave, was a witness to a truth that had been hidden for decades. The horse was the first to sense that something was wrong, that the ground was not what it seemed. And in that moment, the animal gave voice to a truth that the settlers had tried to forget. The final haunting question remains: how many other massacres are there in American history, men who recorded their crimes in ledgers and buried their victims in unmarked graves, men whose stories have been erased from the official record? And what will it take for us to listen? We will see you in the next one.